Very seldom do we get the chance here in Singapore, and particularly with music matters, digital matters, social media matters, to bring real visionaries to the stage who are visionaries in music, technology, and know how to make social lubrication work with technology and music. Would you welcome to the stage Thomas Dolby? Tom, welcome. Here's your mic. That music that we just heard there, that's your music. It's a great song that you created some years ago, but just interesting because you were really one of the first to take synthesized music, shape it in an interesting way, envisioning a whole new way of getting texture back into music.
Actually, the drums on the piece that you just heard were played by a disco lighting console.
A disco lighting console?
Yeah. Because I used to, when I first started doing synthesized music, I used to play drums with a finger, right? So you'd program the kick drum,
right?
Program the snare,
right?
And it wasn't very in time. And one night I was out at a disco and I saw these flashing red and green lights. And I thought, how do they do that? And it turned out that there was a lighting console. And so I hooked that up to my synthesizers, and so the drums on She Blinded Me With Science are actually being played by a lighting unit.
So how did you get the technology knowledge to know how to synthesize those two disparate elements in such a way that you'd create new sonic varieties?
Well, just by messing around, really, Ralph. I've always been a tinkerer.
Right.
I was always the kid that took the transistor radio to pieces to figure out how it worked and so on. And I'm at my happiest when I am meddling and messing around with gadgets and technology that nobody really understands yet. That's the key, is that a new piece of technology comes along and people think, well, this is pretty interesting and different and disruptive, but what are we going to do with it? And that's the moment when I dive in and make a fool of myself.
But you've always liked to position yourself right at the bleeding edge rather than in something that's already happening in the frame, such that you envision something, and we've got a couple of interesting things to show people here today about some of the things that you've done. And we'll just go into our next slide, please, Ed. Can we just move up to our next, no, one back. Let's go one back. Here we are. So here's a picture of you tickling the ivory, so to speak. And just explain to us what that console is. Does that come from a spaceship or the International Space Station? What is that?
You know, it's just a Mac with a couple of monitors. At the moment, I work in a lifeboat studio that I have in my back garden.
We're going to show a picture of that in a little while.
Okay. And this is me at work, you know, just fooling around.
So this is you tinkering and taking sound waves, sound forms, and building them into some interesting kind of structure.
Yeah, I'm always looking for something that excites me. And usually that means something that doesn't fall into any existing category. So I start exploring at the point where genres sort of cease to define music. That's where I begin. So
going back, when you were really starting to mesh these new textures and synthesizers and bringing them into a live kind of framework, here's an interesting picture that we found, which really was at the very birth of what is now deemed electronic dance music, and you were really helped to popularize the kind of forms that people like Skrillex or the Chemical Brothers would do. On that stage that you're playing in, that's in London at the Marquee Club.
Yeah, it's the Marquee Club, and instead of a drummer, I had a DJ, and this was in 1980.
Wow.
So that was kind of early, you know, but things, interestingly enough, you know, across the Atlantic in New York, similar things were starting to happen. I mean, DJs with turntables were starting to take chunks of one song and put them in another song. And I had no idea that was going on. I'd barely been to New York at that point. But at the same point in different countries around the world, similar ideas were emerging.
What do you think was the cause of that change? Because it moved away from just guitar and drums and the kind of rock band kind of framework. Do you think this was because the disco movement had spawned interesting new sounds? Why was that suddenly emerging as a new thematic all around the world?
You know, I think the moment any style of music becomes entrenched, there's going to be people that look to go in the opposite direction. There's going to be the contrarians, musical contrarians.
Right.
And I think what had happened, you know, was that, you know, disco had become so overblown. This was London in 1980. You know, the punk music had sort of come and frittered out a little bit.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were looking, but it was still guitar and drums. There was still the constraint of guitar and drums.
Right.
And so for those of us that were working in electronic music in those days, you couldn't help but feel like a pioneer because there was only half a dozen of us doing it.
And that was a time when people like Soft Cell with Tainted Love and the early forms of Depeche Mode that were using synth, even influenced by Kraftwerk, famous German band. There's a reel-to-reel tape machine in the back of the picture there, to the left of this picture. That was also part of the framework of what you're doing on stage?
It was, yeah. I mean, it was synced up to the machines that we were playing with, and they went wrong all the time. I mean, quite frankly, it was a nightmare. People get nostalgic for this stuff, and they go, "Oh, I love my analog synths and so on." But
yeah.
I'm very happy that now it all just lives in my laptop.
And this was a time when you were in the recording studio, you had to do a lot of stuff that just was not as digitized as it is today.
Yeah, no, everything was manual, and every time you set something up, it was like a house of cards.
Right.
You know, somebody trips over a chord, and the whole thing falls to pieces.
Huh.
And you dare not leave it overnight because the cleaners might come in and jog the wrong knob, and it will all sound different.
Oh. Okay, so here's an interesting picture because this, for those people that don't know, Thomas was really responsible for literally shaping the whole notion of audio and sonics on mobile devices. So this picture here is what?
So this is the Beatnik audio engine.
So tell us about Beatnik, first of all.
Yeah, so Beatnik was a company that I formed in Silicon Valley in the 1990s.
Right.
And I'd spent, 10, 12 years in the music business. I'd had some commercial success.
Right.
I'd played with a lot of my heroes, with, David Bowie and Joni Mitchell and George Clinton, and I felt like I'd done that, and it was no longer exciting me. But I'd been using software and hardware that came from Silicon Valley, and so that was a much more exciting place for me to be.
Right.
And it seemed like a place where sort of maverick ideas were supported, where they were funded, and so it drew me to Silicon Valley.
So you set up a company in Silicon Valley, you called it Beatnik, and the goal and the objective of the company was what?
Well, initially it was to put music on the web. It was to sonify web pages because web pages were, mainly silent.
Right.
And when there was music on the web, it was often streamed, very low quality, dropouts and so on. And I saw no reason why music couldn't be broken up into samples and MIDI, notes and so on. And so for a number of years, we pursued this goal of putting music on the web. Like many .com companies, there was no business there, really. People didn't want to pay for content.
Right.
But in a roundabout fashion, it ended up becoming the core of audio on mobile devices because in order to make it work on the web, it had to be super efficient.
Right.
So it was the smallest software synthesizer ever made.
So you effectively developed the core technology. This was Tinkering Deluxe, where you basically developed an audio codec suitable to work within a phone and ultimately devolved into 2 billion mobile phone devices that your codec was on. Yeah. Tell us about the evolution of that with Nokia.
Well, it's more than a codec, really. I mean, it's a synthesizer. It's a software synthesizer. I mean, the fact it's got a keyboard there is no coincidence because it's sort of like a virtual replacement for the sound card. You remember Sound Blaster cards? You'd have
sure.
So this is like doing that in software on a low-powered device.
So looking at that picture, you've got effectively just a graphic of a keyboard, but effectively that would be the miniaturized version that would then meld into the device itself. You've got the sound waves, the waveforms in the sample editor. What's that box on the right-hand side of the screen?
Well, it was a sound library. So what happened was Nokia came to us and they'd seen some Japanese phones coming out that had a sound chip in, rather like the one in your pocket right there.
That's right.
But those sound chips are made by companies like Roland and Yamaha, and Nokia, who were shipping 100 million phones a quarter, didn't want to have the liability of a hardware chip that cost several dollars in each phone. And so they came to Beatnik and they asked us if we could engineer our software synthesizer to work on their phones.
Uh-huh. And that ultimately, particularly when Nokia were the top dog in the mobile space, unlike today where they've been replaced by the iPhone, certainly by Samsung. Samsung clearly have a large advance in terms of smartphones, but at that particular time, this was revolutionary.
Well, it really was, and I mean, do you mind if I tell you the story? Because
Please.
a lot of people think that technical innovation is the result of some genius with a light bulb popping, you know, in some garage in Palo Alto or something like that. But in my experience, it's very often very random. I mean, ringtones started out using the text message format on a Nokia phone, which is actually, you know, a very simple format. It was designed so that field engineers out testing Nokia networks around Europe could send a text message back to HQ to report their results. It was nothing to do with consumers at all, but it got hacked, and that turned into text messaging.
Oh.
Then, an engineer in Nokia's labs was trying to tune the ringer on their phone to find the most annoying frequency, so that if the phone goes off in your pocket like that, you could hear it even in a shopping mall.
Right.
And a marketing guy, head of marketing, Anssi Vanjoki, was walking down a corridor and heard what he thought was music coming out of the lab. And he popped his head around the door and he said, "Oh, you've got them playing tunes now." And the engineer said, "No, I'm just trying to find the most annoying frequency." And Anssi said, "Well, could you get it to play tunes?" And he said, "Yeah, maybe." So, "Well, program me some tunes and bring them to the marketing meeting next week." So he programmed in 6 melodies into this phone, into a prototype version of the phone, brought them into a marketing meeting, and the Nokia guys all said, "This is great, we've got musical ringtones now, let's ship it." And a lawyer said, "No, no, 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 no. You can't just ship pop songs on a phone. There's publishers, there's writers to think about, there's copyright."
Sure.
And somebody said, "What about if it's a dead guy that wrote the song?" And they said, "Well, are any of these melodies by dead guys?" And somebody goes, "Well, this one that goes diddly dee diddly dee diddly dee dee, that guy's been dead for 150 years." And they said, "Great, let's ship that."
And that's the story. So really, this is carefully prepared spontaneity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you know, Nokia put our synth in their phones, and they asked me to program the polyphonic ringtone version and come up with a new format that was dedicated. So Beatnik basically authored the polyphonic ringtone format that became the world standard on phones.
So you really were the father of the ringtone, which is an
No,
amazing
you were the
thing.
father of the ringtone.
Well, after what you know and what you've just articulated, there's definitely something in that. Now we move completely to something different. This is a former lifeboat, correct?
Yeah, so this is I live in the east coast of England now, and this is in my garden. We're in a very low-lying area that floods every, 10, 15 years. And so I couldn't have the proverbial garden shed studio like most self-respecting former pop stars have in their garden.
Right.
So I decided to go on eBay and find a suitable vessel. And this was actually a ship's lifeboat.
Wow.
That was on the deck of a British merchant ship from the 1930s.
Huh.
And I found local boat builders and converted it, and this is now where I do my work.
So the picture we saw earlier on of you in front of your keyboard where you're tickling the ivories was actually taken in the belly of this boat, which is your studio, which is where you compose and develop and work on your material.
Correct, and it's completely solar and wind powered. I've got a turbine up the mast and solar panels on the roof and a bank of batteries where the engine used to be. So I can work all night just using renewable energy. And
completely quiet, so you've got isolation. From a creative standpoint, it's the place where you feel most creative.
Actually, no, it's very noisy, Ralph. There's waves breaking on the beach and there's seagulls fighting over fish heads, but they all make it into my recordings, and that's okay.
Incredible. Additional sound effects, very naturalistic, very good going. Here's another shot of you, creativity at work. There you are with your digital notebook, your digits in your hand, obviously, writing. That's synthesizer. What is that, Virus TI?
It's actually quite a ravey kind of synth. It's not my most. It's not really my go-to keyboard, but I happen to be using it on the day that they took those photographs.
Amazing. So this is taken inside that boat.
Yeah, this is in the cabin on the boat. Yeah,
in the cabin on the boat. Amazing. Here's another shot. This is one taken of you outdoors. I see there's some solar power. Is that solar powering your synth?
Yeah, I mean via a bank of batteries.
Right.
Yeah.
And where is that shot taken?
It's in Suffolk, East Anglia, England.
So there have been quite a lot of developments because you continue to play, continue to perform. You've been performing certainly over the United States over the years. For many years, you were the musical director of the TED, as in the TED conferences, TED.com, where you basically were the person putting musical texture into TED. And then also, what you've just started to do is you've been appointed as a professor at one of the most prestigious music conservatories in North America. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so starting this fall, this autumn, I'm going to be a professor of the arts at Johns Hopkins University.
That's in Baltimore.
It's in Baltimore, Maryland.
Right.
And Johns Hopkins is mainly known as a research and medical university.
Right.
They received a very large endowment last year with which they're going to improve their arts side.
This is an endowment from the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who gave them how much?
A lot of money, and he's an alumnus from Hopkins. So Baltimore is, in former years was really a hopping city, and it has beautiful architecture, but it had an arts district called Station North, which in the 20s and 30s was like the Broadway of Baltimore.
Wow.
And Johns Hopkins, in conjunction with the city, has bought up some old theaters in that neighborhood.
Right.
And they're trying to bring the people back into the neighborhood. And so what I'm going to be designing and implementing there is kind of like Johns Hopkins' answer to the MIT Media Lab.
Right.
So we have this beautiful Art Deco theater from 1932, and it's being turned into a hive of high-tech activity. TV, film, game developers, recording studios, tech startups, and so on. And the goal is to encourage people to move back into the area and spawn a whole new arts district.
So this passion of yours for teaching and educating people about mixed media, cross-media, social media, you're also conducting a special mentoring session here in Singapore over the next couple of days, where you'll be working with young musicians, young creators, right here in Asia. Does that mean that you have a commitment to the creative development of Asia?
Well, yeah. I mean, firstly, let me say that, when I started out, and in fact, at each stage of my career, I had very few people to mentor me. I pretty much had to learn by doing.
Right.
And so when I went into electronic music, when I went into music video, when I went into tech, the web, mobile, I was just floundering around, just making my own way.
Right.
And I've always wanted to teach and give a little bit back.
Right.
And I think it's really important that you encourage and you engender that sort of spirit and enthusiasm, in young people. I think Asia is a really interesting case in point because it's such a melting pot here.
Right.
And I think the next developments in music are going to come from Asia and the Middle East.
Do you think that what we saw here at Music Matters from people like Maker Studios, or what you sometimes see on YouTube, where there's a whole new generation of people that are not bound by the old traditional rules of music as was conducted in the earlier days by the larger music companies?
Well, I mean, a generation of kids growing up are sharing their experience of learning
right.
with the rest of the generation all around the world, and
right.
that wasn't the case, when we were kids. I was in the bar last night, and I was just thinking there was a local singer singing Western standards. She was
right.
singing "Fly Me to the Moon" and "Misty" and things like this.
Yeah.
And it was obviously, she's from Singapore. It wasn't natural to her.
Right.
But it occurred to me that she has needed to learn to do Western pop music
right.
in order for her career to thrive, right,
right.
as a pop musician in Asia.
Right.
Well, a kid that is in school now that wants to be a professional musician
right.
in the West may grow up needing to learn how to do Oriental styles of music,
Absolutely.
which is extraordinary. When you look at the way the world's economy is going,
right.
it could well be that a musician in England or the USA is going to have to know how to do Oriental music or do Asian music in order for their career to thrive. So it's a big turnaround.
Amazing. Here's a picture of you, look as though you're flying a bomber or some kind of fighter jet, but in essence, see you've got a camera in your left ear, and you dressed up to go flying musically.
Well, yeah, actually, this was, I created a game a few years ago.
Yes, we want to speak about this because
yeah.
you transcended just the musical space, and tell us about how you came up with this idea of doing some kind of game. Here's another picture of you imagineering a soundscape. Tell us about that.
Well, in about 2011, I started recording an album, my first album in 18 years.
Wow.
I mean, if you go away for 2 or 3 years in the music business, people talk about it as a comeback, you know, when you come back. I was away for 18 years, you know. Most of the people that used to like my music are either dead or in jail, you know. And so I'm sitting in my lifeboat and I'm making my new album, and I'm suddenly thinking to myself, well, but people aren't really buying albums these days. What am I doing here? And what are they doing? Well, they're playing video games and they're on social networks. Why not create a socially networked video game and use that as the platform for my music? I mean, I did it before with MTV. I did it with live music. I did it with the web.
Right.
You know, I've always tried to use whatever the current platform is as a way of disseminating the music. And something interesting had happened during the 18 years that I was away, which was that on the internet, hardcore fans had been analyzing my lyrics and annotating chord sequences and writing tribute songs. And they were treating me almost like one of those dead guys, like Nick Drake or someone like that, because I wasn't making music. And they were even doing fan fiction. And they would take characters and people and places and objects from my songs and write their own fiction around it. You know, they'd take a character like Europa or, you know, put her in a submarine or, in this case, a flying boat, and they'd write these whole little scenarios taking on the characters from the songs.
Right.
And so what I thought was, well, I need to get my arms around this, and I created a game called The Floating City, which was essentially a multi-user, web-based network game. And the prize in this game was that you got to download free music, including rough mixes of the new songs as I was recording them in the studio. And people in this game would meet in chat rooms in character. And I would go and lurk in the chat rooms and sometimes spin records.
Right.
And every now and then I would play a rough mix from one of the new songs that I was making.
Right.
And people thought there was a sort of backstory to the game. In reality, they were writing the story themselves as they went along.
So this is really the democratization of your creative process, bringing in your fan base as well as makers of their own music, but woven into the textures that you'd started.
Well, the interesting thing was maybe half the players were from my fan base, but half were just gamers who were intrigued by this and had never heard of me or my music. And they had to sort of collaborate because the gamers were more used to the conventions of games.
Right.
So they had to work hand in hand with the people that knew every line of lyrics and so on in order to solve various problems. So in a way, it expanded and opened up my music to a whole new generation of listeners.
But Tom, this is a puzzle for me. You're a musician, you're a technologist, you're a tinkerer, you like to assemble interesting pieces of sonic architecture. How did you develop the expertise to come up with a video game, and particularly in Asia where MMOG, massively multiplayer online game, is a big deal? Korea, some people, they say that in Korea people play 6 or 7 hours a day on games, maybe more. The gaming industry today is probably bigger than Hollywood. How did you develop that kind of knowledge and expertise?
Well, I don't have the knowledge or an expertise to do it. It's that simple. I mean, that's the case with most of the things that I do. If I have knowledge and expertise about something, I'm no longer interested in doing it. You know, because I'm stimulated by areas where, you know, I'm floundering.
Right.
In the case of the game, I had a little network of experts around the world, mostly moonlighting from their other jobs.
Right.
In fact, the lead programmer was actually, he worked for a credit card company in Canada. And he was sitting in his cubicle, and his boss thought he was working for the company, but actually he was programming my game. And we would just meet on Skype in a chat room every day at 4 o'clock with a prototype of the game in front of us. And there were about 5 or 6 of us who we'd never met. And we created the game, from a bunch of different time zones.
But was this your concept of the game? For example, if you look at that slide we've got up there with different areas in this world where you have Americana with a K, you've got Urbanoia, as in urban, and then you've got Oceania. You came up, that was your concept.
Well, yeah, I mean, the technology behind the game is actually Google Maps. Because there is a way in Google Maps, there's an API that allows you to overlay your own map. If you wanted to do a map of Singapore for bicyclists, you could overlay your own bicycle map of Singapore using their API. So I created this imaginary world with these 3 continents and overlaid it on Google Maps. And that was the technology that we used. So it's already tried and proven, you know, works in all browsers. Google maintain it for me. We just did the artwork and created the sort of the fiction around it.
So you effectively had an online game woven into your music woven into the game, bringing in both fans and people that were contributing to the very structure of the game, and in doing so, really having a whole new way of expressing your creative energies.
Well, absolutely, and you know, I mean, as I was saying, I've just always looked for those kind of platforms. I mean, to just stick with the sort of album tour, you know, routine would not have been exciting for me.
Of course. Okay, so here's an interesting picture, something called the Invisible Lighthouse. You did a fantastic concept last year where you actually went around the world, and tell us about this.
Yeah, so 15, 20 years ago, everything changed in music because the technology became available that would allow you to make an album in your back room instead of a professional recording studio.
You mean with something like Pro Tools, for example?
Yeah, with Pro Tools on a laptop, you know, Logic and so on.
Right.
And the same thing is now happening with film and video technology. You can get a camera for, you know, a couple of $1,000 that is every bit as good technically as what a Hollywood, you know, big Hollywood production is using.
Right.
And so young filmmakers, instead of being dependent on, you know, finding a footing in the business as a runner, as a T-boy, you know, working your way up, you can get together with a group of friends, maybe some out-of-work actors and writers and wannabe directors. You can pool your savings and go make a movie.
Right.
And so I went around a bunch of film festivals last year, and I saw movies like this that were made, you know, 90-minute zombie flicks made by like a bunch of guys, you know, using their credit cards.
And shooting maybe even on a mobile device.
Yeah, in some cases being shot on a mobile device. So of course, I mean, you know, based on what you know of me, this was too good to be true. I don't know. I've never pointed a camera before.
Right.
I've directed videos, but I've never, you know, looked through the lens.
Right.
But I decided to dive in and make a film myself. And the film was called The Invisible Lighthouse. It was about a lighthouse that I grew up with, which I can still see from my house, on an island off the coast of England, which was closed down this year. And but the film is really about memories. It's about my childhood memories, some of which are false, and what they mean to me, and how it felt bringing my kids back to that part of the world and having them grow up with it. Anyway, I made the film myself. It's a 45-minute film, and last year I took it out on a tour of old cinemas and film festivals, and we projected the film on the screen.
Yeah.
And myself and the other artist that you see there, who does live Foley and plays guitar, he was doing live sound effects, and I was doing a narration and playing the score to the film. So it's almost like, you know, when they do silent movies with a live orchestra, it's like that, but it was the filmmaker there on stage.
So it was your film being back projected in a conventional cinema theater, your music fronting it. This is almost like taking an old medium, translating it into a modern medium, making it a completely futuristic medium.
Absolutely, and you know, it worked for the venues because little independent movie theaters are struggling to distinguish themselves from the kind of, you know, Cineplex type cinemas you get in a mall. So the venues are really into it. Some of them have taken out their seats and put in soft sofas, and you've got Wi-Fi. You can have a glass of wine and a panini, you know, and watch a performance like this.
Right. So it's amazing. And clearly you got an audience to come and see this. It was highly successful and really fueled another whole aspect of your career and made it creatively interesting for you, and just another part of a successful chapter in this ongoing bleeding edge creativity that is you.
Well, thank you.
But it's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way that the fact that I'm going to start teaching now is a reflection of the fact that, you know, rather than slow down altogether, rather than retire, just take it easy, I'd like to keep the momentum going, but I'd like to share it. You know, I'd like to share it with the next generation and try and hope that some of that sort of enthusiasm rubs off on them.
Well, hopefully there'll be people here in the audience today who will be fortunate enough to be at some of your mentoring sessions, and hopefully you'll uncover some great new musical genius or great creatives here in Asia, because clearly it's part of what you want to do in the future, to really spend a lot more focus on developing talent here in Asia that you maybe can take to Baltimore, your new home, and see what happens with that.
I certainly hope so. Thanks, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, a wonderful, warm reception for Thomas Dolby. Thomas, thank you.